In the spring of 2019, I watched a man in $400 boots dump 800 used oak wine barrels along my fence line and laugh when I told him this was farmland, not a landfill. 3 years later, he was standing in that same field again, asking me to sell him back the wood he'd thrown away. If you've ever had someone try to bury you under their own garbage, tell me where you're watching from. Then like and subscribe before the county comes back to find me again for what I built out of it. So 3 things sitting on top of me the day my grandfather's lawyer handed me the deed to Colson Orchard. The first was Hargrove Vineyards' offer of $85,000 for my 22 acres of dying apple trees, an offer that came with a 30-day deadline and a warning that the land would be worth nothing once the county rezoned the creek bed. The second was every person in Larkspur County who'd already decided I was the granddaughter who'd come back from the city to sell off what her grandfather spent 41 years building and who wouldn't last a single winter proving them wrong. The third was a single locked question sitting under my ribs since the morning I found 800 barrels stacked along my property line like a wooden wall. How does a woman with $4,000 left in her checking account turn somebody else's trash into proof, in front of every person who laughed at her, that she was right and they were wrong? My grandfather, Eli Colson, planted his first row of Gravenstein apples on this land in 1978, the same year he married my grandmother in the barn that still smells like diesel and old rope. He died in November of 2018, 11 months before the barrels showed up, and he left me 2 things: 63 acres split between orchard, hayfield, and a dry creek bottom nobody had irrigated in a decade, and 11 leather-bound ledgers filled with his handwriting, dated and cross-referenced by weather, by soil moisture, by which August the codling moths came early, and which September the deer stripped the low branches bare. He never wrote a single sentimental word in any of them. He wrote things like October 4th, frost 2 weeks early, moved cider apples to South Barn before the cold snap took the sugar out of them, and graft failed on the east row, bark too dry when I cut it, should have soaked the scion overnight. 41 years of entries, 2,200 pages by my own count, and not once did he write my grandmother's name in grief, or mention missing his own father, who'd cleared this same creek bottom by hand in 1951. The closest he came to sentiment was a line from 1987, the year I was born. Girl came early, like the Gravensteins this year, both sweeter for it. I read every page twice before I planted a single thing that first spring, tracing his handwriting with my finger the way you'd trace a scar to remember how it happened, because the man who raised me after my parents' accident never explained himself more than once, and I wasn't going to waste what he'd already spent a lifetime figuring out. The barn still smelled the way it had when I was 9 years old, diesel and rope and the particular mineral sourness of turned soil, and some mornings that smell was the only thing that convinced me I hadn't imagined the whole inheritance, that it was real weight sitting on real land, and not just grief wearing the shape of a deed. The offer from Hargrove Vineyards came on a Tuesday, hand-delivered by Marcus Hargrove himself, in a truck that cost more than my grandfather's entire equipment shed. He wore a cream-colored blazer to walk a dirt orchard road in July, and he smiled the whole time he told me the creek bottom on my land was the last piece keeping the county from approving his resort expansion, 300 rooms and a golf course spread across the ridge above Larkspur Creek. $85,000, he said, more money than the orchard would clear in the next decade at the rate my grandfather's yields had been declining. He put his hand flat on the porch rail like he already owned it, and told me a woman alone wasn't going to keep 63 acres solvent past one bad frost. I noticed his shoes then, Italian leather soles caked in orchard dust he clearly hadn't expected, and I remember thinking that a man who dressed like that to walk a dirt road had never once had to guess whether a frost was coming by the smell of the air the way my grandfather taught me to. I told him I'd think about it. He told me I had 30 days, because after that his surveyors were moving forward with or without my signature, and the county's easement board wasn't going to wait around for sentiment. Before he left, he glanced at the barn, at the 11 ledgers stacked visibly on the porch table where I'd been reading them all week, and said, almost kindly, that whatever homespun wisdom was written in those books wouldn't survive contact with an actual balance sheet. I didn't answer him. My grandfather never wasted words on a man who'd already decided what he thought, and I was learning, that week, exactly how much restraint that habit required. 11 weeks after that visit, on a Thursday morning in September, I woke to the sound of a flatbed truck idling at the edge of my north field, right along the boundary line that separated my land from the creek bottom Hargroves Winery had been leasing rights to since the previous owner sold it off. By the time I got my boots on, the driver had already dropped the first load, 200 used oak barrels, staves gray with old tannin stains, stacked 4 high in a wall that ran nearly 60 feet along my fence. 800 barrels total by the end of that week, the driver told me when I asked. All decommissioned from Hargrove's cellar, upgrade to steel tanks, and all of it, according to the paperwork he waved at me, dumped legally on land the winery still believed belonged to the creek bottom easement rather than to me. I called the county the same afternoon, and I called Hargrove Vineyards front office twice more that week, and both times a receptionist told me someone would call back, and no one did. It took them 4 months to confirm what the surveyor's stakes should have told anyone with eyes. The dump site sat 11 feet inside my property line, not the winery's, and the barrels were mine to deal with, whether I wanted them or not. 4 months of walking past 800 barrels every morning on my way to check the orchard irrigation, smelling the old wine tannin bleed out of the wood every time it rained. 4 months of Marcus Hargrove's office insisting, through a junior assistant who clearly hated making the calls, that the matter was under internal review. When the county surveyor finally walked the line himself with a transit and a stack of 1979 filings, he stood at the exact spot where the barrel wall began and said, almost embarrassed on Hargrove's behalf, that whoever ordered that dump job hadn't bothered to check a boundary that had been on public record for 4 decades. That was the first time I opened my grandfather's ledgers looking for more than apples. Buried in the back of the 9th volume, dated 1994, was a single entry about a batch of white oak fence posts he'd cured in the old hay barn for 3 winters, before he'd trussed them near the well. Wood remembers how it was dried, he'd written. Rush it, and it splits behind your back for 20 years. Let it sit where the air moves slow and it outlives you. I stood in that field with 800 barrels nobody wanted, worth nothing to a winery that had already written them off as waste, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something besides grief sit still in my chest. Dale Pruitt, the agricultural extension agent for Larkspur County, came out to the property that October, ostensibly to assess storm damage to the hayfield, though I suspected Hargrove's office had made a call first. He stood at the edge of the barrel stacks with his clipboard and told me, in the particular tone men like him reserve for women standing on land they think should belong to someone else, that reclaimed barrel oak had almost no commercial furniture value without industrial kiln drying, that the moisture content alone would warp anything I built within 2 seasons, and that the county's own extension bulletins from the state agricultural school backed him up on every point. He said it the way you'd explain gravity to a child, patient and a little bored, tapping his pen twice against the clipboard for emphasis, the way I imagine he'd tapped it in front of 100 other landowners across the county who'd stopped listening to him years ago. He told me the state agricultural school had run the numbers on reclaimed wine barrel wood decades ago and found it structurally inferior to kiln-dried stock in every measurable category, and that he'd be doing me a disservice as a public servant if he let me waste a season finding that out the hard way. I didn't argue with him. My grandfather never argued with anyone twice, and neither would I. He came back that December, unprompted, after word had gotten around that I was dismantling the barrels rather than hauling them to the county dump like any sensible landowner would, and stood at the barn door, watching me pry hoops loose with my grandfather's bar. He asked, not unkindly, whether I'd read the bulletin he'd left me. I told him I had. He nodded like that settled something and left without coming inside, and I noticed he never once asked what the moisture readings actually said, only what the bulletin predicted they should say. I just started stacking the staves in the hay barn the way the 1994 entry described, spaced 2 fingers apart, shaded from direct sun, air moving through the gaps like the barn itself was breathing. Otis Kemp, whose alfalfa fields bordered mine to the east, told half the county before Christmas that Eli Colson's granddaughter had lost her mind stacking wine trash in her barn instead of selling out to Hargrove like any sensible person would. He said it at the feed store, at the diner, at the fence line whenever he caught me checking the barn temperature with the little mercury thermometer my grandfather had left hanging by the door. He never said it to my face except once, leaning on my gate with a smirk he'd clearly practiced, asking if I planned to sell splinters door to door once the barrels finished rotting. I told him I'd let him know when I had something worth selling. He laughed the whole walk back to his truck, and I heard him repeat the splinters line to his hired hand, loud enough for me to catch it through the open barn door. 2 months later he stopped by again, this time under the excuse of asking whether my irrigation runoff was flooding his lower alfalfa field, though the ditch between our properties hadn't carried water since August. He stood at the same gate and asked, with the same practiced smirk, whether I'd started a bonfire pile yet, or whether I planned to heat my whole house with wine barrels come winter. I told him the barn stayed warmer than his fields did most winters anyway. He didn't have much to say back to that, and he left faster than he'd arrived. I went back inside and wrote the date in a new notebook, my grandfather's habit finally becoming mine, because I intended to remember exactly what he'd said, and exactly when he'd said it, the same way his ledgers remembered every frost that came early, and every promise the weather never kept. The first 18 months were the loneliest work I've ever done, and I did nearly all of it with my own hands, and the $4,000 I had left after the funeral costs, and the property taxes. I dismantled the barrels myself, one at a time, prying the iron hoops loose with a bar my grandfather had used on fence posts for 30 years, sorting staves by grain tightness and tannin depth, the way his ledgers described sorting apples by sugar content. I built the drying racks out of hayfield fence rail, spaced them the width of my own forearm apart because that was the measurement written in his hand in the margin of volume 6. I learned to read moisture in white oak the way he'd taught me to read it in soil, pressing my palm flat against the grain and waiting for the wood to tell me something instead of trusting a meter. Some nights the diesel smell from the old tractor mixed with the sharp sour tang of wine tannin still clinging to the staves, and I'd stand in that barn until midnight listening to nothing but the creak of drying wood and the distant bawl of Otis Kemp's cattle, wondering if I was building something or just delaying the inevitable sale everyone in Larkspur County seemed to think was already decided. My checking account dropped to $1,100 that first November, low enough that I sold 3 of my grandfather's unused irrigation pumps just to cover the property tax installment, and I remember standing at the kitchen counter, doing the math twice, certain I'd made an error, because the number was too small to survive a bad winter, and I had no cushion left if the wood failed the way Dale Pruitt promised it would. I kept a second thermometer nailed inside the barn door that winter, checking it twice a day the way my grandfather's ledger described checking frost risk on the orchard rows. And I wrote every reading down even on the nights my hands were too cold to hold the pencil steady, because a ledger with gaps in it wasn't a ledger my grandfather would have trusted, and I wasn't going to build my proof on anything less careful than what he'd left me. By the second spring, I had my first finished piece, a dining table built from 11 barrel staves and a single slab of my grandfather's own reclaimed apple wood, the grain running in a pattern that looked, if you stood back far enough, like the rings on a barrel head. I sold it for $600 to a woman 2 counties over who found me through a photograph her sister had shared online, and I cried exactly once that night, alone in the kitchen, before I put the money in an envelope and started the next piece the following morning. I never let anyone see that. My grandfather never explained his losses to anyone either, and I understood by then that the only apology worth giving Larkspur County was a finished piece of furniture nobody could argue with. Word moved slower than the wood dried, but it moved. By the 3rd year, I had a waiting list of 40 names and a bank account that had finally stopped shrinking, and that was exactly when Hargrove Vineyards sent someone new to my door. A compliance manager named Priya Achari, sent, she told me carefully, to resolve the outstanding easement question before the winery's resort expansion went to final county approval. She had a folder of documents suggesting my grandfather's original 1978 deed had a clerical error placing the creek bottom under shared access, a claim that would have let Hargrove reclaim 11 acres of my land without paying a cent for it. She was polite in the specific way people are polite right before they take something from you, and she left a business card and a deadline of 60 days for me to contest the filing or lose the acreage by default. I read every page of my grandfather's original deed that night, cross-referenced against the ledger where he'd recorded the surveyor's exact measurements in 1979, and found the discrepancy myself before Priya Achari's firm ever had to admit it existed. That was the same season the whole country's furniture supply started coming apart at once, a hardwood shortage driven by shipping disruptions, and a spike in kiln-dried lumber tariffs that hit factory-finished furniture particularly hard, because rushed, industrially dried wood that had never cured longer than 6 weeks began failing at rates the trade press couldn't ignore, warping in humid rooms, splitting at the joints within a single winter. Meanwhile, every piece I'd built from 3 years of slow, shaded curing sat exactly as flat and true as the day I'd finished it, because my grandfather had been right about wood, remembering how it was dried, and the wider market was suddenly discovering the same lesson the hard way, at scale, with reputations attached. The Larkspur County Harvest Exposition that October put reclaimed furniture on the same judging floor as 3 factory-line producers from 2 states over, part of a regional trade feature meant to showcase local craft against mass production, judged in front of nearly 600 attendees under a white event tent that smelled of kettle corn and diesel generators. Dale Pruitt was sitting on the evaluation panel representing the extension office, the same clipboard, the same tone, ready to repeat the same warnings about barrel oak he'd given me 3 years earlier standing in my own field, and he said as much into the panel's microphone before the test began, telling the crowd that reclaimed wine barrel wood, however charming, simply couldn't hold up against properly engineered kiln-dried stock under real household conditions. The humidity stress test the judges ran that year, an unusually harsh one because of a heat wave that had rolled through the valley all week and pushed the tent's internal humidity gauge past 90%, cracked 2 of the 3 factory pieces visibly within the first hour on the exhibition floor, the joinery on one dresser splitting loud enough that a row of onlookers actually gasped. My dining table, the same design as the one I'd sold 3 years before, sat under the same conditions for the full 4-hour test without a single hairline shift in the grain, the finish holding as flat and even as the morning I'd oiled it. Dale Pruitt didn't say anything when the judges called it. He wrote something in his notebook, closed it without looking up, and left before the ribbon ceremony started, and Otis Kemp, who'd come to the fair mostly to needle me one more time about splinters, went very quiet at the fence rail where he was standing, arms crossed, not laughing at all. Marcus Hargrove found me at that same exposition, not the way he'd found me the first time in his cream blazer with an offer and a deadline, but standing at the edge of my booth with his hands in his pockets, looking, for the first time since I'd met him, like a man who'd run out of leverage. The regional oak shortage had hit his own barrel program hard. New French and American oak barrels for wine aging had tripled in cost and doubled in lead time, and his winery was sitting on an aging program with nowhere near enough vessels for the next vintage. He asked, carefully, almost apologetically, whether I still had contacts for properly cured oak, whether the barrels he'd once dumped on my land as trash might be worth buying back, cured, at whatever price I named. I told him the same 800 barrels he'd thrown over my fence line were long gone, already staves and tables and chairs and shelving standing in 40 different homes across 3 states, and that if he wanted properly cured oak from me now, it would cost him a supply contract on my terms, 5-year minimum, my price per board foot, no renegotiation clause buried in his lawyer's language, and payment scheduled the same way he'd once demanded I sign away my land, 30 days, no extensions. He asked, almost quietly, whether I remembered telling him I'd think about his offer that first summer. I told him I remembered every word of that conversation, including the part where he'd told my grandfather's ledgers wouldn't survive contact with a balance sheet. He didn't have an answer for that. He signed the contract 11 days later, in my kitchen this time instead of his winery's tasting room, at the same table my grandfather had eaten breakfast on for 40 years. Priya Achari's folder about the disputed easement never made it back to the county recorder's office, and I heard secondhand that she'd left the firm's compliance division entirely within the year, moving to a role that had nothing to do with vineyards or easements. The years since then have folded into each other, the way seasons do when you're paying closer attention to the ledger than the calendar. I expanded the barn to twice its original size in 2023, added a second drying room built to my grandfather's exact spacing specifications down to the width of a forearm between racks, and hired my first 2 employees, both women from Larkspur County who'd been told, in one way or another, the same thing I had once been told about what a woman alone could and couldn't hold on to. The business cleared just over $300,000 in revenue that year, more than the orchard had earned in any single season under my grandfather's management, though I never once heard him say revenue was the number that mattered most, and I've tried to keep that same order of priorities even now. I never took a single offer to license the curing method to a furniture conglomerate that came calling twice, once with a number large enough to make me sit down at the kitchen table and actually consider it for 3 full days, running the figures in a ledger of my own the way my grandfather would have, before I turned it down, because he never sold anything faster than the land was ready to give it, and I wasn't going to start being someone else with his ledgers in my hands. Otis Kemp sold his alfalfa fields to a hay cooperative in 2024 and told a mutual acquaintance, not me directly, that he supposed he'd misjudged how stubborn a Colson could be. Dale Pruitt transferred to an extension office 2 counties away the year after the exposition. I heard he still cites the same lumber bulletins, just to a different audience now. Marcus Hargrove and I have renewed that supply contract twice since, and the last time he stood in my barn, he ran his hand along a barrel stave the way you'd touch something you regretted throwing away, and didn't say a single word about it. Last month I handed my grandfather's 11th ledger, now sitting beside 4 of my own, filled with a decade of moisture readings and grain notes in my own handwriting, to my niece, who spent her whole summer sanding staves in that same barn, instead of scrolling through her phone on the porch, like every other 17-year-old in the county, her hands developing the same particular calluses along the base of her thumb that I've had for years now, and that my grandfather had for the 4 decades before that. She asked me, the day I handed her the ledgers, why I'd kept every single page instead of just the ones that turned out to matter, and I told her that was exactly the mistake Dale Pruitt and men like him always made, deciding in advance which observations were worth recording and which ones weren't, when the truth was you never knew which frost, which failed graft, which humiliating fence line conversation would turn out to be the one detail that saved you 3 years later. I told her the same thing my grandfather never got the chance to tell me directly, because he died before I understood I'd need it. Everyone around you will tell you exactly how long they think your patience should last, and the only ledger that matters is the one where you write down whether they were right. She asked me if I was ever afraid, those first 18 months, that the barrels really were just trash and Otis Kemp really was laughing at something true. I told her, that's the question every person doing something no one respects yet has to sit with alone in a barn at midnight, and the only way through it is the same slow, unglamorous stacking, 2 fingers apart, that nobody's watching and nobody's applauding, until the wood tells you the truth, whether anyone else believes it yet or not. There's a photograph on my kitchen wall now of that original fence line, taken the week the barrels first arrived, before I'd touched a single stave, the wood still gray and sour-smelling, and stacked exactly the way that flatbed driver had left it, and next to it, a photograph of the same fence line today, empty, just grass, and the shadow line where 800 barrels once sat like a wall someone built to bury me. My niece asked once whether I'd ever thought about taking the second photograph down, since the fence line itself doesn't prove anything to a stranger walking past it now. I told her the 2 pictures side by side are the only ledger entry that needs no explanation at all. I still haven't decided whether to tell you what happened to the $85,000 offer I turned down that first summer, because the number Hargrove's lawyers eventually put on the table to keep that easement dispute quiet makes the original offer look like the joke Otis Kemp always thought I was. But if you've made it this far listening to a woman talk about barrel staves and county fairs for 20 minutes, you've already shown me you're exactly the kind of person who finishes what they start, so you already know what to do before the next video loads.